Medieval battles are usually shown as bold charges, shining armor, and clear winners. The real thing was messier and far less predictable. Most fighters weren't knights at all. They were ordinary men pulled into service, carrying practical weapons, and trying to stay together in loud, crowded conditions where plans fell apart fast. This video breaks down what a medieval battle actually looked like on the ground, how armies were raised, what soldiers really wore, how formations worked, and why fear, fatigue, supply, and sickness often mattered just as much as skill with a weapon. Number 1. Raising the army. Most medieval battles started with paperwork and obligation, not with some heroic volunteer army. In much of medieval Europe, a lord could call on service because that was built into the social and legal system. Land came with duties, towns had charters with militia requirements, and rural communities could be told to provide a set number of able-bodied men for a campaign. The details changed across centuries and regions, but the core idea stayed the same. When the call went out, many men had very limited room to say no. Some fighters were professionals in the medieval sense, meaning they lived as warriors year-round. A lord's household troops, men-at-arms, and their support staff could be paid or maintained through land and patronage. Others were semi-professional, men who trained more often, served more regularly, and hoped to earn wages, loot, or advancement. Then there were the largest group in many armies, especially in earlier periods, levies and local militia, men who normally worked farms or trades and were pulled into war when needed. That mix matters because it shaped everything else, from discipline to equipment to how long an army could stay in the field. It also explains why medieval armies could look uneven. One part might be well armored and tightly organized under a noble's banner, while another part is a cluster of neighbors with basic gear and very little training. On top of that, armies were rarely national in the modern sense. They were networks: a king, major nobles, minor lords, allied contingents, hired specialists, and sometimes outright mercenaries who signed on because they knew how to fight and needed work. Even when a campaign had a big political label attached to it, the rank-and-file reality was usually more practical. Most men were there because a lord demanded service, a town council ordered it, a contract paid for it, or their situation left them few better options. Number 2. Who the soldiers really were. The popular image is knights everywhere, but in most medieval battles, knights were a minority. The backbone was usually infantry, spear carriers, men with pole weapons, archers or crossbowmen, and support troops who handled the unglamorous jobs. A knight also wasn't a single fixed type across the Middle Ages. In some eras, a knight was mainly a mounted warrior whose status and equipment set him apart. In later centuries, many heavily armed men still used horses for movement and prestige, but often fought dismounted when the situation called for it. Men-at-arms is a useful term because it covers the broader group of armored, trained fighters who might be knights or might not have the title, but had similar battlefield roles. Below them were common infantry, and these men came from everywhere. Peasants from villages, apprentices and craftsmen from towns, foresters and hunters with experience using bows, and experienced campaigners who had fought before but never became noble. This social range created sharp differences in expectations. Noble and wealthy fighters were more likely to be captured for ransom because they had value alive. Ordinary soldiers were less likely to get that kind of treatment, especially in the chaos of a rout. Status also affected support. A knight might have a servant or two, spare gear, and a way to replace equipment. A common soldier might have one weapon, one set of clothing layers, and no safety net if something broke. That doesn't mean ordinary infantry were helpless. Well-armed infantry could be highly effective, and many famous medieval victories depended on disciplined foot soldiers. But it does mean the lived experience across an army was not equal. Two men could stand on the same field and be in completely different worlds. One protected by armor, training, and a network of followers, the other relying on a shield, a spear, and the men beside him. Number 3. Armor without the movie shine. Medieval armor was practical, expensive, and often less dramatic looking than people expect. Full-plate armor didn't dominate the entire Middle Ages. It developed over time, and even in late medieval Europe, Where plate harness became extremely advanced, not everyone could afford it. The most common armor for many soldiers was layered clothing designed to blunt force and reduce cuts. A padded garment, sometimes called a gambeson or acketon, could make a real difference. It looks plain, but it works, and it could be made from materials more people had access to. Mail armor, the interlinked ring shirts people often call chainmail, was widely respected because it resists slashing cuts well and lasts a long time if maintained. The catch is that mail is heavy, it takes time to make, and it doesn't make someone immune. Blunt force still hurts, and hits to the head, face, or joints are still dangerous. That's why helmets mattered so much. A helmet is not just a nice to have. It can be the difference between walking away and not. Many soldiers prioritized head protection even when they couldn't fully armor the rest of the body. Shields also played a big role depending on the time and place. In earlier medieval periods, shield use could be widespread. Later on, as armor improved and two-handed weapons became more common, shields might be less universal among certain troops, but they never fully disappeared. The big thing to understand is that armor was a system, not a costume. It had to be wearable for hours. It had to let a man move, and it had to be repaired. Straps broke, rivets failed, padding got soaked, and metal needed care to avoid rust. On campaign, fighters were constantly adjusting and maintaining gear. That maintenance doesn't show up in the romantic image, but it shaped what armor actually looked like day to day. Scuffed, dented, patched, and very much built for survival, not for style. Number 4. Weapons that win fights. Swords are famous, but they weren't the main tool in most medieval battles. They were often sidearms, useful, prestigious, and deadly in the right moment, but not always the best choice in a packed formation. The workhorses were spears and pole weapons, because reach matters. A spear is relatively cheap, quick to produce, and effective with limited training compared to many other weapons. As tactics evolved, polearms expanded into many forms. Bills, glaives, halberds, and other variations designed to thrust, hook, or strike with leverage. Against armored opponents, blunt force weapons like maces and warhammers became more important, because they could damage through armor by transmitting force, even when the armor wasn't cut open. Axes were common too, in both one-handed and longer forms, partly because they were effective, and partly because the technology and woodworking culture already existed. Missile weapons also shaped battles, but not in the clean, sniper way people imagine. Bows and crossbows were serious military tools, and skilled archers could be highly valuable, but archery in battle was often about volume, timing, and pressure. Arrows and bolts disrupted formations, forced men to raise shields or close visors, wounded horses, and created a sense that nowhere was fully safe. Crossbows offered strong power and simpler training in some contexts, but loading could be slower and required equipment. Longbows, where they were used, demanded years of practice and specific physical conditioning. No matter the type, missile troops also had a supply problem. Carrying endless ammunition wasn't realistic, so commanders had to plan when and where their archers would do the most work. On top of that, weather mattered. Rain and damp conditions could affect bowstrings and fletching, and muddy ground could limit movement. In real campaigns, the best weapon was the one that fit the situation. Long reach to control space, a solid shield when missiles were flying, and a reliable sidearm for when formations collapsed into close fighting. Number 5. The march and the logistics. By the time an army reached a battlefield, many men were already exhausted. Medieval campaigns ran on movement, marching to a mustering point, marching into contested territory, and marching again as commanders tried to find good ground or avoid being trapped. Roads were often rough, and armies moved at the pace of the slowest part of the column, including wagons, animals, and men carrying equipment. Food was a constant concern. Some armies had supply trains, but even then, feeding thousands of people for weeks is hard without modern storage and transport. Foraging, requisition, and buying from local markets were all common, and that created tension with civilians. Armies could strip areas of food quickly, which meant later arrivals found less. Water was just as important and often more dangerous. Large groups contaminated local sources fast, and stomach illness could spread through a camp in days. Meanwhile, the simple physical toll added up. Blisters, strained joints, and minor cuts mattered because they could become infections. Footwear was not standardized, and long marches in wet conditions could wreck a man's feet. Sleep was inconsistent, and poor rest makes everything worse. Slower reaction, lower morale, more arguments, more mistakes. Discipline also mattered more than people think. A medieval army wasn't a machine. It was a large crowd of armed men trying to move together. Keeping order required constant effort, and even then, stragglers were common. Stragglers were vulnerable to robbery, capture, or just getting lost. That's why soldiers often tried to stay near their local group or under a familiar banner. Not because they loved military structure, but because being alone on campaign was risky. The battle many people imagine is one day. The reality is that the campaign leading up to that day often decided who arrived ready to fight and who arrived already worn down. Number 6. Camp life and daily pressure. Camps were noisy, crowded, and rarely clean. A medieval army on campaign created a temporary town that moved across the landscape. There were cooking fires, animals, carts, tools, and a constant flow of orders and rumors. Sanitation was a major problem. Latrines might be dug, but they could overflow or be ignored, especially as the camp grew. Waste, mud, and limited clean water created ideal conditions for disease. This is one reason historians regularly note that illness could reduce armies dramatically, sometimes more than combat did, especially in long campaigns. Food distribution reflected hierarchy. High-status men ate better and more consistently. Common soldiers might get basic rations, and if supplies were tight, the bottom ranks felt it first. Pay could be irregular too. Some soldiers fought under clear contracts, but others relied on promises, customary obligations, or the hope of reward. That uncertainty affected morale. Another constant in camp was maintenance. Weapons needed sharpening, armor needed checking, bowstrings needed care, and broken straps needed replacement. Smiths and craftsmen were essential. So were grooms and farriers for horses. Camp followers, traders, cooks, laborers, and family members in some cases also supported the army, though they could face the same dangers when things went bad. Training in camp varied. Some units practiced drills and formation work. Many did not, or did very little. Commanders could give basic instructions, but turning untrained men into a disciplined formation overnight was unrealistic. What commanders could do was organize, assign positions, define who follows which banner, and set simple rules like stay with your group and don't break ranks. Even that was a struggle in a crowded camp where fear spreads fast. When rumors said battle was near, behavior changed. Men checked gear more often, slept less, and listened harder for orders. It wasn't cinematic. It was pressure building in a place that already felt unstable. Number 7. Formations and how command worked. Medieval command had real limits. There were no radios, no instant updates, and no overhead view of the field. Communication depended on messengers, shouted orders, horns, drums, and visual signals like banners. That system worked well enough when things were calm, but battle is not calm. Dust, smoke, terrain, and noise could break the chain quickly. That's why medieval armies relied on structure before contact. Troops were arranged in divisions, sometimes called battles, often with a center and wings. Commanders tried to anchor flanks on terrain, like woods, hedges, ditches, or hills, to prevent being surrounded. Missile troops might be placed forward or on the sides to harass the enemy as the main line advanced. And in some battles, archers used stakes or natural obstacles to protect themselves from cavalry. Heavily armored men might be positioned where the line needed staying power, because their equipment and training helped them hold ground. Cavalry, when present, was often used for scouting, flanking pressure, and pursuit, not just for a dramatic head-on charge. The reason is simple. Horses and riders are valuable, and charging into a solid wall of spears can be a fast way to lose that value. So commanders waited for openings, uneven ground, a wavering unit, a gap, a tired enemy. At the soldier level, the key concept was cohesion. A line that stays together is safer and more effective. A line that breaks becomes a crowd, and a crowd can panic. Medieval commanders knew this, and much of what they did on a battlefield was aimed at keeping their own side from losing shape. That's also why banners were so important. In the confusion, a banner told men where to go, who was still fighting, and whether their unit was holding or falling back. When banners went down, or became separated, the battlefield became harder to read, and small problems could spiral into bigger ones. Number 8. The first phase of fighting. Many medieval battles began with probing rather than immediate collision. Skirmishers and missile troops tested the enemy's position, and commanders watched for weaknesses. Missile fire, even when it didn't cause huge casualties, affected behavior. Men raised shields, tightened formations, and sometimes advanced sooner than planned just to end the pressure. Terrain mattered immediately. A muddy field, a slope, a narrow approach, or a patch of rough ground could slow movement and break formation. In practice, an advance was rarely perfectly straight. Lines drifted, bunching happened, and one side might angle to protect a flank or to avoid bad ground. The psychological side was just as important. Battle noise is overwhelming. Thousands of voices, metal striking metal, horns, drums, and the constant motion of people and animals. Even disciplined troops had to fight the instinct to step back when danger got close. This is where experienced soldiers had an advantage. They weren't fearless, but they understood the rhythm of a battlefield and could keep working under pressure. Less experienced troops were more likely to overreact to sudden movement or a burst of missile fire. That's why many commanders tried to keep raw troops supported by steadier units nearby. Once the main lines closed, the fight changed fast. It stopped being about individual skill in an open space and became about maintaining position, keeping enough room to use weapons, and not getting pushed out of place. Battles could also pause and surge in waves. Units would press, tire, pull back slightly, and press again. The idea that medieval battle was one clean clash is mostly a myth. Many fights were a stop-start grind shaped by fatigue, morale, and local advantages rather than one decisive moment right at the start. Number 9. The melee and the breaking point. Close combat in a medieval battle was crowded and exhausting. The space to swing wide was limited, especially in tight formations, so stabbing, short strikes, and pushing mattered more than dramatic blows. Shields, when present, were active tools, used to shove, to hold space, to protect against sudden hits. Pole weapons could dominate when there was room to use their reach, but if the press became too tight, fighters relied more on shorter weapons, or simply on keeping balance and position. Visibility was limited. A soldier didn't see the entire battle. He saw the men directly in front of him, and the banner he was trying to stay near. The real danger often came from breakdowns in the line. If men started to drift away from their neighbors, gaps opened. If gaps opened, pressure increased. If pressure increased, fear spread. At that point, morale became the deciding factor. Medieval battles frequently ended when one side lost cohesion and began to retreat. That retreat could turn into a rout quickly. Once a group starts running, it becomes hard to stop because everyone behind them assumes something terrible has happened. Pursuit is where casualties could spike, especially if cavalry could move freely. Captures also happened in this phase, particularly among higher status fighters who could be ransomed. That economic reality shaped behavior. Some men tried to take valuable prisoners instead of continuing to fight, while others focused on survival and keeping their unit together. The aftermath of a rout wasn't just physical damage, it was organizational collapse. Units became mixed, banners separated, leaders lost track of who was still present, and the battlefield filled with scattered pockets rather than clear lines. Reforming after that was difficult, sometimes impossible, and many commanders chose to withdraw rather than push exhausted troops into another round without structure. Number 10. Aftermath, disease, and the long cost. When the fighting stopped, the problems didn't stop. The wounded needed care, and medieval medical treatment was limited by knowledge, supplies, and time. Some injuries that might be survivable with clean conditions became serious because camps were dirty and bodies were exhausted. Infection was a constant threat, and so was dehydration and sickness from contaminated water. Armies also had to deal with practical tasks, collecting usable equipment, managing prisoners, burying the dead when possible, and restoring enough order to move again. Looting happened for practical reasons as well as greed. Gear was valuable, and many soldiers were not paid in a reliable modern way. That doesn't make it pretty, but it helps explain why battlefields were stripped quickly. For prisoners, status mattered. A captured noble could become a financial asset through ransom. A captured common soldier was less predictable. Outcomes depended on local custom, discipline, and the situation. Then there's the broader impact. A village that lost a handful of working-age men might struggle for years. Farms needed labor, trades needed skilled hands, and families depended on people who didn't return. Even survivors could come home injured or weakened, changing what they could do for the rest of their lives. Psychological effects were real as well, even if medieval people didn't use modern terms. Sleep problems, heightened startle responses, irritability, and withdrawal show up in many veteran accounts across history, and medieval war was no exception. The harsh reality of a medieval battle is that it was not only the moment of contact between two lines, it was the entire chain. Forced service, uneven equipment, hard marching, camp disease, limited command control, fatigue-driven fighting, morale collapse, and then the slow cost afterward in sickness, disability, and economic damage that could linger long after banners moved on.